There was quite a heated exchange in Tynwald this month about government's policy relating to accepting refugees. Minister Kate Lord Brennan was surprisingly robust in defending the Cabinet Officer's approach, and this led to several members, including the mover of the motion, Joney Faragher, giving as good as they got. We'll hear later from the Minister and House of Keys veteran Juan Watterson, but first, why did Joney Faragher bring this debate to Tynwald?
So firstly, I brought a motion in April 2022 about this it was in the wake of the Ukraine situation, and the island had been so welcoming, and there was a lot of calls for us to have had a more rapid response. So I requested that the Council of Ministers set up a framework so that we weren't scrabbling about essentially in future to formulate a response, and there wasn't a delay. So this policy was supposed to be laid and for debate, which wasn't done. It was actually just put as a lay before, which is kind of generally accepted as a way to maybe get it on the order paper without people noticing.
But there was a full report there, wasn't there? That went. Was it June or July, Tynwald?
October Tynwald. It was supposed to be for the July Tynwald being brought for debate, which was the promise that was given. But yeah, it was laid before the October Tynwald, and it's rather than being a framework, it's more an explanation of why we can't have a framework. Which I think was just a missed opportunity and a missed chance to analyse the benefit versus the cost, and to see what lessons we might be able to take from the situation in Ukraine. I feel like, as a lot of members input into the debate, it was just a missed opportunity there to actually get some facts and figures around this issue and see where we wanted to go as a country. Yeah, so...
And the Minister was quite robust in her defence of the document, and her argument, if I'm trying to paraphrase, was something along the lines of, if you want something to happen, you need to be much more explicit and clear about what that is. And her reading of what was said in Hansard, what was said in the Tynwald debate, was that what was contained in the report was meeting the requirements.
Yeah, and I guess it is open to interpretation, and I think that's probably one of the issues with when the Council of Ministers do amend somebody's motion like they did with mine in April 2022 without engaging with that member first to explain their intentions, and they leave it as quite an openly interpretable sentence, I think. I guess what's happened is that I and other members thought it meant one thing, and the Council of Ministers had different intentions that they didn't communicate. Now, to me, the onus is there upon the Council of Ministers to communicate their intention clearly. So I'm just disappointed, really, and I think that the way that this was responded to by the Council of Ministers was inappropriate.
And again, though, the Minister will say, well, it's all well and good you telling me that I have to be clear, but is there not more of an onus on you, having brought both these motions in the first place, to be very explicit and very clear about what it was that you were looking for?
Well, I was clear. My motion was amended by the Council of Ministers. It was their motion that was not clear. Mine was extremely clear. It was the Council of Ministers' motion that we're now talking about, that there is differences of interpretation over. And obviously the Council of Ministers thought it meant one thing and backbenchers thought it meant another thing. There was no communication from the Council of Ministers on that matter, and they did not engage with members, which was what they'd promised in the debate in order to work up the policy document, and then they laid it before rather than bringing it for debate. So the actions of the Council of Ministers are definitely questionable, and that's not open to interpretation. The Minister did not address any of those points in her response, and I think that's quite telling in itself.
The Minister was very keen to intervene in the debate, and certainly seemed, I would say, irritated by reinterpretation, as I think she would have seen it, of what had been said in the previous debate. basically the answer appears to me, at least, to be that people should be sitting down and talking to each other prior to these things happening in Tynwald, so there is that level of clarity, and perhaps that would then allow both sides to be more explicit about what it is that they were intending.
Indeed, and I would strongly urge the Council of Ministers to at very least take from this situation that their relationships with the backbenchers need to be improved by them. The onus is on them to do that, because I did try to reach out to the Cabinet Office Minister to request a meeting, and I did request to know why it wasn't being laid for debate, but those communications were essentially a closed door, which meant that I therefore brought it to Tynwald for a debate. That didn't need to happen.
So ultimately, what is it that's now not there that you would have liked to see?
A framework for whether or not or what the island's response would be in a future situation such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so that we weren't scrabbling around making officers work extraordinary hours and trying to keep up with the public sentiment. If we had a framework in place, that wouldn't have been the case. So that was what we were trying to avoid. That isn't what we've managed to get at the end of the day.
And interestingly, another issue that was raised in Tynwald, the Kate Brunner report into COVID, was arguing very strongly in that sort of vein that the response to COVID would have been better had a more robust framework and policy been in place dealing with emergency situations.
Yeah, and it's not rocket science. I think this is a fairly basic standard of government to get a policy in place where and when you can, especially in the wake of an incident such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine that did leave us kind of exposed, really, in a way in which our ability to respond wasn't in line with the public's demand that we respond. So it, like I say, and many members said, it's a huge missed opportunity for government to have actually brought a policy that would support everybody in the future and that would align with what the public wanted them to do.
And interestingly, another debate that occurred in Tynwald was in relation to the government's economic strategy and the Our Island Plan targets, one of which is to increase the economically active portion of the population, and effectively you could kill two birds with one stone with what you're suggesting and delivering more people to potentially be those economically active people.
Well, absolutely, and this was a point made several times. Meta-analyses of all of the studies undertaken of the economic benefits of refugees actually shows that the main one is for small jurisdictions that have an ageing population and or imbalanced demographics. Now, that is us. That is one of the big problems that we know that we face as a jurisdiction now and into the future. We have seen the recommendations from the Population Rebalancing Committee, yet this obvious solution is staring us right in the face that we could have worked up something that worked for us as well as working on an international stage, and we've rejected the opportunity to do that.
Would you agree, though, that this is an issue which divides the Manx population? There are many people in the Manx population who would thoroughly agree with what you're saying, but there are equally many people in the Manx population who would say, actually, if we've got money to spend, we need to spend it on our own people and our own services.
Yes, and what issue doesn't divide the Manx population, Phil? That's the question. There are always going to be two sides to an issue. I think one of the important things that we need to do as people who are in leadership positions is to ensure that we make decisions based upon evidence base and based upon statistics and facts, and that we then target information campaigns to show the public why we are making those decisions. That's really what we should be doing as people in leadership positions, not leaning into stereotypes or misinformation and not putting guesswork into potential policy documents.
That was Joney Faragher, MHK. Next up, Minister Kate Lord Brennan. There was a fairly how would we put it? It was certainly lively debate in relation to refugees. I think you came over as quite defensive in terms of your comments. Why was that?
Well, it's interesting, really, because I think that there is a sort of minority of Tynwald members that are very intent and have a clear desire for the Isle of Man to participate in some way in large-scale resettlement schemes to do with refugees. And in the UK, it's local authorities that can participate in these schemes, and it's been looked at in different ways and debated in the past. It's true. But the recent debate has been about the government's updated policy as to the acceptance of refugees, and indeed a report on the consultation and the experience that we'd gone through in connection with the dedicated support to support Ukrainians. That actually important to say that they're never designated as refugees. But I think that where some of the tension has come about today is that so for those members wishing to argue strongly for this, they are perhaps not happy with the government's position, which has been to say that actually because we were asked to put forward, the commitment was for a long-term policy. So the policy that's been put out by the Council of Ministers to say that, actually it needs to be for the government of the day to activate any response. And in doing so, it's really important that the Council of Ministers should have due regard to the resource available of the island, the ability of government to cope with such support, things like housing and education, the availability and support of third sector and the community. In essence, we're saying, if you're going to be a responsible government, you should take account of these things, not just be writing to the UK saying, hello, can we please participate in these schemes, and will you make that happen for us? Noting that costs money, and that there is very little control, and also it's in the policy and government action anyway that the Isle of Man does contribute to international development causes through funding, which is given that you want to support refugees in a way in the world which is safe and successful and done in the right way. That's done through funding. So in Tynwald, there has been assertions that government has somehow been flouting the will of Tynwald, even though Tynwald has never resolved to join or support resettlement schemes. So it's quite interesting that some of the arguments being made by advocates, they're not setting out the arguments based on their principle of belief of advocating for the Isle of Man and joining resettlement schemes. Instead, almost as a deflection, they are criticising government for having this policy and not following the will of Tynwald from a previous resolution in April 2022. And I have had to say in the court today that's fundamentally wrong, and actually council stands by its published policy, which is responsible and is the right thing to do in terms of taking account of the island's position and the interests of the people here.
And resettlement schemes basically means people moving from a potentially a war-torn country and resettling in the Isle of Man. That's effectively what that's all about. But as you say, looking through Hansard of the previous debate and even listening to this debate, it wasn't that clear what the case was for that.
That's right. It's quite a fascinating thing, and I think it's interesting because it's good to have passion and it's good to have debate, and that you're not always going to agree. But actually, if somebody is bringing their arguments, they need to align that with the motion that they've got tabled and make that case. And I think that particularly in this debate, maybe that's why things have been left so confused, because then people have been, sort of almost inferences or expectations that wasn't there. I've certainly not given any previous commitments in Tynwald on this particular report or policy or matter that we haven't come forward. So I completely reject the assertions made that we haven't carried out the commitments.
What is available then in terms of refugees? So, for example, obviously there's the tragic situation currently taking place in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. If there were refugees from that part of the world, that conflict, is there anything that the Isle of Man is able to offer there?
The best way to support in that case is to we've got international development funding from very tight resources that we know that government is dealing with, and donations are made, and they're published as the different agencies and charities and development workers that they go to. The constraints are something that you cannot get away from. The Isle of Man has to operate within the common travel area, so we can't do things fundamentally out of step with the UK. In addition to that, we can't grant people asylum. So for those members that are saying you need to go and set about doing something very specific in the way that they're talking, and by the way that we've already been told that the Isle of Man government would have to fund and pay to do this stuff, and actually also would have to put in place at least the same things that local authorities do in the UK. So you also have to think, is this right, and is this a right and correct course of action for the island to do, which is actually, if you look at the policy statement that's now published, is requiring the Council of Ministers to take account of the balance of things and how it's best to support international development commitments, but also how it's important to make sure we're thinking about the things that matter to people here.
It's possible, though, that there are people, and I know there are people on the Isle of Man who think actually we are a relatively wealthy society, and if we can't help people in the most dire situations, then there's something perhaps morally wrong with the way we're approaching the world.
I think that there needs to be intent behind any response and commitment. So why the support to the war in Ukraine worked really well was because there was an absolute political will. Council of Ministers didn't like dilly-dally around. We said, okay, we want to do what we can, and we started that off with donations, and then ultimately we ended up coordinating all sorts of support as best we could to support people from Ukraine coming here. And that requires a well thought out and dedicated resource to do that. So you need to be intentional. So the way this policy sits now is that it's for the Council of Ministers of the day to decide to activate a response. So if you're in a position where you think actually we want to pursue particular support in this respect on island, then actually it's for the Council of Ministers to decide there are other ways to contribute to supporting displaced persons across the world. We are going to see an increase in that, and we need to take account of these things in the round. Government is compassionate and caring about these things, and in taking that responsibility, you have to think about how you go about them and not underestimate that task.
Finally, I chewed the political cud with Juan Watterson. One of the things that cropped up in the January Tynwald was a little bit of a spat between some of the Tynwald members and the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Kate Lord Brennan, over interpretations of what Tynwald may or may not have agreed. How does this actually work? I mean, the Tynwald decisions are obviously logged somewhere. What happens then in relation to ensuring that government follows the general direction set for it by Tynwald?
Well, as you say, there's a difference of opinion on interpretation, and so that's the first lesson to any member of Tynwald looking to move a motion. Be very careful with your words, because what's voted on in the chamber is the words that are on the page in the motion, not whatever commitments have been given to you verbally by others in the chamber. So that's the first thing. When motions are carried, they follow through into a book called the Tynwald Policy Decisions Report, and that keeps track of all of the motions passed by Tynwald that are effectively then Tynwald policy. It's largely up to individual members to hold ministers to account for pursuing those, and obviously then some things will be more in favour and some things will go higher up the priority list depending on how many people are interested in it. In that sense. So, but that is a document that's used often by the scrutiny committees in terms of the annual reporting that's done from ministers to those committees to see how they're doing on following up those recommendations by Tynwald as well. So it is a reasonable closed-loop system. There are, of course, going to be political differences in terms of whether things have gone far enough or been done the way that a member would have wanted them. But overall, that's how the process works. And generally, it works quite well. And historically, governments will think twice before running roughshod over what Tynwald has passed, because whilst they're not legally binding, they do seem to be morally and politically binding. And we've seen in other jurisdictions that governments that get too divorced from what their parliaments want don't tend to last that long.
And perhaps alarm bells should have started ringing for Joney, in as much as I understand it, the amended motion that she put to Tynwald was unanimously supported, which kind of then means that it could have meant all things to all people.
And sometimes that's the case, and that's why it's so important to make sure that the wording that's there is going to deliver exactly what you want. If you look back at a year ago, the motion on the swimming pools, for example, there's a clear commitment in there that Tynwald agrees that the swimming pool will be kept open until such time as a replacement facility is done. That remains Tynwald policy until Tynwald overturns it. So in that particular instance, the minister has indicated that should be coming forward with a motion. I wonder whether that would have been the case had Tynwald not already formulated a policy. So it does go to show the importance of Tynwald motions and the weight that they carry.
Because of course we have in Tynwald at the moment a relatively inexperienced bunch of politicians. I don't know, do you refer to politicians as a bunch? A gabble of politicians? I don't know what they would be, but they're relatively inexperienced, so you don't have perhaps the wise and wily old heads that used to be in Tynwald that would guide you and basically say, okay, doesn't matter what the minister says to you behind closed doors, it's what's said in the debate in Tynwald, and particularly, as you say, what's actually subsequently agreed either as an amended motion or the original.
Yeah, I think one thing that strikes any parliamentarian when they come into this place is just how immensely complicated the whole machinery is. There's the machinery of government, which is pretty labyrinthine in itself, and in any organisation with 8,000 employees in it's going to be quite a complicated organisation, and then put on top the parliamentary levers and buttons that we can press and use, which again can sometimes seem quite archaic and some bizarre, but actually they're there, they've stood the test of time, and they continue to evolve to make sure that they do the fundamental purpose, which is setting policy, choosing a government and holding it to account. They're the core elements of what our parliament's there to do. So it's not necessarily simple, and our standing orders books are pretty weighty tome, but get to grips with that, and you do get to grips with how to use the levers of government. Yes, there's always a double-edged sword, though. People vote for a change in some places, and that's what they get. The downside is that they lose the corporate memory that comes with it. So it's nobody's fault particularly. It's a tough ask of anybody. But yes, when you and I were starting off in politics in the mid-thousands, it was a different game. There were a lot of people around who had got 20, 30 years experience. That's not the case anymore. And it's great when people do engage with the process, try to work out how to best achieve an outcome, and start finding these sort of tools in the toolkit. But they are there, and they're in the little blue book, they're in the little green book, and they're there to be used.
And government does occasionally report back on how well it's meeting its Tynwald approved objectives, doesn't it?
Well, that Tynwald Policy Decisions report's updated annually by government in terms of giving its progress report on how it's doing. Government tends not to be too shy in terms of coming forward when it's been doing a great job on things, and that's great. That's absolutely wonderful. And in scrutiny, it's our job to make sure that there's a push forward on the things that matter to the people outside of this building, and that's really important, and that's something that we're there to hold government's feet to the fire on. The process is there, and members need to use it.
That was Speaker of the House of Keys, Juan Watterson. Who do you think was right, Joney Faragher or Kate Lord Brennan? And what about the sage advice from Mr. Speaker? Useful? Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Good-a-mayo. Thanks for listening.